Hi there. I decided that starting this week, I'm going to make a quick video each week that summarizes the questions on last week's quiz, just so you can kind of double check what you were supposed to do. Most people did fine on the quiz, but a few people missed some specific questions. So the first question should have been the easiest question in the test. You were given f of x equals 5 to the x. You had to find f of 3, so you take 5 to the third power. 5 times 5 is 25, times 5 again is 125, and 125 is the correct answer. Now originally I had the answer marked incorrect on the first time I released this quiz, and a couple of you pointed that out. I did correct it quickly and gave you the points for that, but yeah, 125 is the right answer. The second one's a lot easier to miss. What you have on this is the function g of x equals 2 to the power of x plus 3. You're supposed to find g of 4. The key to this problem is you've got to either work out the exponent in your head and just realize this problem is asking you to do 2 to the 7th power, or you've got to be careful to put parentheses in your exponent. If you don't, and you just type in 2 to the 4th plus 3, you're going to end up getting the answer 19, which is wrong. The right answer is 128. On the third problem, you're back to 5 to the x, and this time we're trying to find f of negative 1. So what we got to do is take 5 to the negative first power. There's nothing wrong with just typing this into a calculator and seeing what you get. If you take 5 to the negative first power, you get 0.2. That's the first answer, and that's right. The reason that works out is, remember, a negative exponent means you do the reciprocal. So this is the reciprocal of 5 to the first. Well, 5 to the first is 1. You do the reciprocal of that, you get 1/5, and 1/5 is the exact same thing as 0.2. And of course, then we move on to some story problems. The first one, it talks about Minneapolis, where right now there's 425,000 people. It's growing at a rate of 1% per year, and the question is, how many people will they have 15 years from now? So your basic growth formula says that you take P, the number there are now, times 1 plus R, raised to the t power. And R is just your rate of growth, t is the time. So you can see what I did is I took 425,000 times 1 plus 0.01, the rate of growth has to be a decimal. You raise that to the 15th power, and the exact answer is not one of the choices, but you can see that's pretty close to 490,000. Of all the story problems, the one about Whittemore was the most missed one on here. It tells you Whittemore has about 475 people. It's losing people at a rate of 0.6% per year, and we want to know how many people it'll have 10 years from now. The things that trip people up on this are, first of all, the fact that it's losing people, it's going down in population, and second, that the rate of decrease is 0.6%, and a lot of people goofed up what you put for the R because of that. Now, before I talk about actually doing this, I'm going to mention, if you look at your choices, the last one, 504 people, doesn't make any sense because it's losing people, so it's got to be less than what you started with. It also doesn't make a whole lot of sense to use the very first choice, because that would be like losing half its population in 10 years, and 0.6% is not that big of a decrease. So right off, you can narrow it down to just a couple of choices, and that lets you make a little bit more intelligent guess, even if you didn't know how to do the whole problem. So the formula for these does say that you have A, the amount at the end, equals P, the amount you start with, and then in parentheses, 1 plus R to the t power. The thing that's hardest on this is the R, and it does say it's losing people at a rate of 0.6% per year. Losing people is why I've got a minus in the middle, because that rate of growth is negative. And 1% would be 0.01, We have 6/10 of 1%, and that's why it's less than 0.01. It's 0.006. There were some people that used 6% or even 60% in their problem, and that's what screwed up their answers there. But you do have 475 times 1 minus 0.006 raised to the 10th power, and if you crank that out, you get about 447. Finally, there's a couple of interest problems. The first one talks about simple interest. You borrow $200 at 5% simple interest. How much total money will you have to pay back 3 years from now? So the formulas that matter here are that I, the interest you have to pay, equals PRT, the principal times the rate times the time. And you can find the total amount you have to pay back, which is what we want to do in this problem, by taking the principal plus the interest. So what I did here is I took $200 that we borrowed times 0.05, 5% interest, times 3. If you crank that out, you get 30. We want to find the total amount, so I added 30 plus the 200 we started with, and your answer is $230. Both of the last two problems where you had to actually enter the answer yourself, there were a couple of issues that came up based on how people entered answers. And again, when you take your quizzes, I see the answers that you type in. I get exactly the screen that you submitted back to me. And while it does automatically score things, in general, I go back and I'll look through and try and figure out what went wrong. There were some people, like on the previous one, that put 230 with a dollar sign after it instead of just the number, or instead of like dollars 230. And if that's what you did, you got the problem right. I went back and I made sure that that was credited. Typically also, in most things, I'll just take off half a point for each problem you missed, while the auto scoring thing online will actually tell you that you missed 1 point. So most of these you did better than you thought. So the very last problem here, it says you put $1,000 in an account that earns 10% interest compounded quarterly, and we want to know how much money are we going to have in 5 years. This is the most complicated of your formulas, but we are going to keep using this as we go on. The formula says A equals P, and then in parentheses it says 1 plus R over N to the NT power. Now A is the total amount you have at the end. That's what we're trying to find in this problem. P, the principal, is always what you start with, and it tells us you put $1,000 in an account, so P's got to be 1,000. R is your rate of interest. Again, you always put that as a decimal, so 0.10. N is the number of times it's compounded per year. In the problem, it says compounded quarterly. That's why N is 4. And T is your time, your number of years, and here that is 5 years. So once you know what everything is, basically you just crank out the formula and you see what you got. I took $1,000 we started with, times, in parentheses, 1 plus 0.10 over 4. Make sure all of that's in parentheses, and you take that to the, and the exponent should also be in parentheses, to the 4 times 5 power. Especially if you've got like an old cheap calculator, sometimes it's easier if you just take it to the 20th power. You do 4 times 5 in your head, and then you don't need to worry as much about what that exponent is. The problem says to round this to the nearest cent, and so this would be $1,638.62. Now, I actually accepted 61 cents, even though I shouldn't have on there, but you would technically round it up to 62 when you write out your answer. This was another one that when I put in the possible answers on the computer for it to accept, I thought I had thought of every possible variation people might put on it, but you guys came up with some new ones that were correct. And again, when I go back and I look at those, I do try and give you credit for what you've done. Because my goal, especially in this very weird time where we can't be together, is to be as fair to you guys as I can be. Well, that's what was up with last week's quiz. This week, of course, you're learning about logarithms, and hopefully you'll do well on the quiz that is to come.